someone who's actually been in government, former Conservative government minister, Steve Baker, who I'm delighted to say joins us now. Very good afternoon to you, Steve.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Thank
you very much indeed for having me on.
I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with a single word that Sam Armstrong said in terms of, politicians have, they've asked the question, what do voters want on this issue of migration? And every single election, even Keir Starmer and that lot had to play along with this in 2024. They were asked, do you want more or less migration? We'd like a lot less, please. And they've been promised it. We've never got it. Why have politicians not delivered it? And do you have any faith, whether that legal or illegal, and illegal has become a much bigger issue in recent years, do you have any faith that this government is going to tackle either of them?
Well, I certainly don't have any faith that a Labour government will tackle these issues. If I did, I would have joined the Labour Party, and I certainly don't. So, no, but I mean, Sam raises a very good point. I'm afraid year after year, including in manifestos on which I stood, we said we'd get migration down to the tens of thousands and then didn't. Now, I don't know why ministers didn't do that, because I was never a minister in the relevant department and didn't have the conversations within government. But honestly, I would love for successive Home Secretaries to be asked the question, why didn't you keep that manifesto?
And it's not like it was 150,000 or 100,000. It went up under the Boris wave after Brexit, which is why it's even more insane when we could control the numbers, to over 1 million people. 1.2 million migrants came to this country. It was about 800,000 net in 1 year alone.
Well, I'm very fond of Boris, as most people seem to be who are on the centre-right. But
no, I'm not.
I'm very, very conscious that if I was to criticise Boris, I get an enormous backlash.
So
but
what?
It has to be said.
What?
Well, it takes a bit of time to get through. I mean, it has to be said that Boris, on some of the issues that people really care about, amongst his key voters, they should be really disappointed that Boris let migration get out of control as he did. I mean, again, I really don't know what Boris, it has to be said, were doing. It was very clear that although migration for people like me was not the top issue in the Brexit vote, it was very clear people expected migration to be brought under control, and Boris didn't deliver it.
He did the exact opposite, yeah. But then illegal migration has kind of taken over from that. But do you agree with Keir Starmer that Nigel Farage is scaremongering over channel migrants?
No, I don't agree with him. The reality is that in politics, it's essential that you give voice to legitimate public grievances. That's part of the job. Our Parliament is a crucible for doing just that. And Nigel Farage is right to give voice to those public concerns, and indeed so is Robert Jenrick, so is Chris Philp, the Conservative Justice and Home Affairs spokesman. They're right to give that voice, but it is really important that you give voice in a way which does actually say what you're going to do about it, and which doesn't unnecessarily alarm people. But that is the tightrope which politicians choose to walk. So I think if Keir Starmer is going to be critical of Nigel Farage, he should be really very specific about what he thinks Nigel's saying that's inaccurate. But criticising him just for giving voice to legitimate public grievance is actually deeply counterproductive.
Do you think your own party, the Conservatives, you're no longer an MP, but do you think that they are, frankly, trailing behind reform in terms of tackling some of these key issues? I mean, everyone expects that Kemi Badenoch at party conference is going to be announcing things like, we're going to leave the European Convention on Human Rights and the like, but, reform are already way ahead on that stuff.
Well, look, there's a great realignment of politics going on at the moment. It used to be that the main axis of politics was socialism versus capitalism. These days, it's basically identity. On the one hand, cosmopolitan globalists who are very happy with international institutions and lots of migration, and on the other, communitarian nationalists who are much more concerned. And that realignment is really throwing all electoral coalitions into the air, and politicians are really struggling to deal with it. Well, in the midst of all that, people have just got very legitimate and practical concerns. They'd like illegal migration under control. And that's why I think Keir Starmer's comments actually are pretty dangerous. Trying to suppress legitimate opinion is not the right thing for a Prime Minister to be doing. And then on the other hand, of course, he made the Island of Strangers speech, which turned out to be inauthentic, because when his own people called him out on it, he backed away from it.
Yeah.
And that's even worse, because then you can't trust a thing he says. So he's in a terrible mess. Obviously, I think he's the wrong man to be Prime Minister. I'd love for him to do the right thing. And I promise, if he does the right thing and stops the boats, stops illegal migration, I promise I'll come on your show and congratulate him on the
as indeed would I. I've always been very clear. I'm not party political on these things. I will criticise policies or people I think do the wrong thing, and I will support when there is a good policy. The other day I remember saying, oh, this is a good policy from Labour, and I'll always say it when it is. But this is the thing. What do you make of the police and their involvement in this? Because they get dragged into this, but then, my view is the police politicise themselves, or the police leaders have, not the men and women on the street doing the tough job. But we've got protests, Epping and Canary Wharf and many other places around the country. A lot of outcry over that decision on Friday from that Court of Appeal judge to basically say, because there might be trouble outside hotels housing illegal migrants, then you can't give in to that because then you might get more trouble, and you encourage that. I mean, quite a bizarre argument, I thought. But riot police being put out, you've got 1,500 local families, kids, mostly led by women, local residents, no violence at all, people holding those awful national flags, and the riot police turned out. What do you make of that?
Well, I remind myself of the Pelian principles, and that one of those was that the public are the police and the police are the public, and that's really the way things ought to be. And the proportionality of policing is absolutely crucial. So it's one thing to have riot police on standby round the corner in case things pick up. It's another to present them immediately to the concerned public. But rank and file police officers, of course, deserve all of our sympathy. I'm old enough now that they're all starting to look very young. and senior police officers, while on the one hand, senior police officers are entitled to operational independence. The reason they have that is so that people aren't persecuted for political ends. The problem, of course, is that in terms of ideology and where they prioritise police action, unfortunately, it's been out of kilter with public opinion for a long time. And that's why we introduced elected police and crime commissioners.
How's that worked out? Come on.
Well, it's not worked out terribly well, partly because, of course, the police have resisted any kind of political control, but then they're getting it both ways because of this very political problem. I would say this is a good time for police and crime commissioners to make very clear what their police priorities ought to be, and to make it very clear that, yes, the police have got operational independence in terms of who's pursued through the courts and through the justice system, but that police and crime commissioners are entitled to say, no, that is disproportionate policing.
Yeah, I see that again and again and again. Can I ask you also, I know you're a Christian and your faith is a big part of your life. What do you make of the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, criticising the Reform Party and Nigel Farage in particular, and saying that his policy on deporting migrants, policy I massively support, and indeed so does large members of the public, that this was knee-jerk and that it was not a long-term solution. He's now currently the acting head of the Church of England. Should archbishops be speaking out on political issues, and indeed speaking out saying he wants the two-child benefit cap to be axed as well? Is this his business? Is this within his remit?
It shouldn't be his priority, and I wish they'd stop it. I mean, honestly, since you ask, over the years, I've really wished that bishops and archbishops would prioritise preaching the gospel. I'm confident when we get to heaven, there'll be neither borders nor boundaries and no need for child benefit. But I wish they'd help more people get there. I mean, it is absurd that year after year, you hear more on public policy from religious leaders than you do on spirituality. Now, I've always tried to keep my religious views out of my policy decisions.
Tony Blair style, we don't do God.
Well, if people ask me, then I give an honest answer. I feel I'm under a command to do so. But it's a weird situation we are in, where actually we have an established church, but politicians don't do God, and it works pretty well. But I just really wish it would work the other way round. I wish the bishops and archbishops would really desist from politics and socialist pronouncements, as your previous guest said. I mean, as Gavin Ashenden, I'm all in favour of Gavin Ashenden being the new Archbishop of Canterbury. I think if he was, I think I might rejoin the Church of England from the back.
Very interesting. Let's talk about Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister of this country. She called you lot scum at one point. Every Tory was scum. I had to apologise for that. She's also called for the wealthy to pay their fair share of tax. Like many people would argue that she's pretty well off on a six-figure salary, buying a second home. She's got a property empire. She doesn't. She's got a grace and favour apartment in Westminster as a result of her job. Not many of us get a free apartment as part of our job, but she's put her home in her constituency in Ashton-under-Lyne into a trust, avoiding inheritance tax, and conveniently around the same time buys herself an 800-grand property, a flat in Brighton, which is not where she lives or works, but in Hove near Brighton, and she's declared to the taxman that is her primary home. She's also appears to be registered to vote in all three places. Has she done anything wrong?
Well, she might not have done anything wrong. And this is, of course, one of the issues with politics is that sometimes innocence is no excuse. And certainly, I mean, I nearly exploded during your news item, exploded with laughter when I heard a Labour spokesperson saying that it would be, I think they said, absurd if somebody volunteered to pay extra
Yes.
tax. I nearly exploded. I've spent years listening to Labour politicians saying we needed to do more against avoidance. They never popped up to say the public were right to avoid paying extra tax. I mean, it is comically hypocritical. The truth is that for politicians, particularly deputy prime ministers who perhaps aspire to replace the incumbent prime minister, should be paying the tax that Parliament intended. And I don't think that Parliament intended that people change the declaration of their main property in ways that are open to challenge, as this one obviously is, in order to diminish.
She hasn't moved. She hasn't moved to Hove. That's not where she's going to be deputy prime minister of this country, is it? It's not a constituency, although some people say it's that she can run, and she's hoping to get a safer seat there. Or she's got a big threat against her in her current constituency, but it's not her main home. It's not in any meaningful way her main home.
Well, that appears to be the situation, but I'm very conscious that the last thing I want is to be dragged through this controversy when actually it's all about her. She should be asked these questions over and over and over again until she's given satisfactory answers or until she's resigned.
Is this just sexism or classism and everyone has a go at her because of who she is? That's what some are claiming.
No, I think it's a bit daft to us when you haven't done it, but others have said she's amassing a property empire, and that is daft. To having a second home is not a property empire.
Lots of people would like to just own one home.
Well, indeed, and I'm getting involved with house building for precisely that reason. There are far too few homes being built. They're too expensive, and what we need is to turn house building on its head. We need to deliver far more affordable homes, low energy consumption homes that people can be proud to live in, beautiful homes for families.
I would say so. Small flats in Hove don't cost 800 grand.
Well, it's a pretty expensive home, isn't it? A flat that costs 800,000. And quite honestly, if she can afford it, I don't really begrudge it to her. But what I do begrudge is having spent 14 years in Parliament, listening to Labour politicians be really quite hysterical about not just tax avoidance and evasion, but tax planning. That is just arranging your affairs to pay less tax. And then at very best, it appears the Deputy Prime Minister has engaged in tax planning to minimise her tax liability. And then a spokesman pops up to say that it would be absurd if someone volunteered to pay extra tax. Well, they can't have their cake and eat it and expect to get away with it.
Well, he was a local councillor. He was not official spokesman. But Steve Baker, very interested to get your thoughts, former Conservative government minister.